Hello and welcome to Credit Versio's Q&A Wednesday live for May 12th. I am your host, David Michalek. Every Wednesday we stream live to both our Facebook and YouTube channels at 6 p.m. Eastern Time to talk about credit and answer your questions. So please take a moment, introduce yourself, let me know where you're from. If this is your first time joining us, please let me know. And thank you so much for coming. I'm very happy that you're here. And I see we got some regulars here. Mike, welcome. Good to see you. Scotty, thanks for coming. Appreciate you being here. Welcome. And we're going to get started. We want to make sure we get started promptly every time. Let me just lower this a little bit. Excellent. Okay, very good. So I've been in the credit industry for about 9 years now. And I personally conducted over 10,000 one-on-one credit repair consultations. And believe me when I tell you, our credit report and scores play an enormous role in so many areas of our lives. When we have employers, insurance companies, landlords, banks, just to name a few, who are looking at our credit reports to see how we honor our obligations. You can see why credit reports do a lot more than decide if we get approved for a credit card or a car loan. Having great credit is mandatory because credit reports aren't just credit reports anymore. They are character reports, and they tell the story of what we do when entrusted with credit. That's why we do these weekly calls. That's why I brought with me today John Ulzheimer. Now, normally, this is where I take about 30 seconds to dazzle you with his amazing resume and his accomplishments in the credit industry over the last 30 years. But I'm not going to do that today because I made a highlight reel. So let's go to the tape.
John Ulzheimer is America's most recognized credit expert. With 30 years of experience in the credit industry, having worked for both FICO and Equifax, he's the go-to authority for answers to credit questions. Here to answer your credit questions, Credit Versio presents John Ulzheimer.
There he is. Welcome, John.
Wow, that was great.
Yeah. You got a little sneak peek into that last week, I think, when I finished putting that together for you. So I hope you like it.
No, I love it. I love how you have a little bit of overweight John and a little bit of in better shape John kind of peppered throughout the
I wanted
the
to
video.
show that, like, this is a guy that's not just serious about credit. He's into fitness. He's into bettering all aspects of his life. Excellent. Okay. Well, let's see. I don't know if I can move you up, John, or if you're just sitting low, or hold on here.
I can adjust this. There we go.
That. There we go. I want to make sure that we're sort of at the same height. Okay, great. Well, John, I want to start with a very interesting conversation that I had yesterday, in fact, with a young woman. I don't know if she's going to be here or not, but she reached out to me in kind of a panic because she's in her first round of disputes, and a couple of weeks into it, she noticed that her score was 90 points lower than what it was when she started. Now, one of the things that you and I have talked about, in fact, you even did a video on this, or maybe it was an article, that we can establish that the dispute process itself is not something that causes a drop in credit score. The score is always going to come from the credit report. And what I found when I took a little bit of a closer look at her credit report was she had one trade line, which was a brand new credit card. I think it was less than a year old. And the second was a collection. And that was it. Now, the collection was an old account that was from 2016. And I believe that got deleted. And that might have been, I would suspect, considering there's only 2 accounts on her entire credit report, that might have been the cause. But that being the case, I thought we would start our conversation today about thin files and what happens when people are either credit invisible or have a thin file. And perhaps the volatility that comes with that kind of an account, because you and I have talked about this before, and maybe me a little bit more so, just because I deal with so many credit repair clients. That credit is such an emotional subject for a lot of reasons, and any movement, especially a downward movement, is a very traumatic thing, especially if you don't know what happened. So maybe you can talk a little bit about the effects of a thin file, what a thin file is, what credit invisible is, and then we can swing back around and talk about maybe how we remedy that by adding some credit.
Sure. So the term thin file or credit invisible, these terms all come from different places, so they don't all mean the same thing. Credit invisible is a term that was coined by the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, or the CFPB, and they did a report several years ago and indicated that about 40 million Americans are credit invisibles, which in their definition is someone who either has no credit score or has an otherwise limited credit history, but they didn't really go into any specificities. FICO uses the term thin file, and a thin file under FICO's scoring systems is any credit report that either has 1, 2, or 3 trade lines. So collections, third-party collections and public records are not included in that count. Inquiries are also not included in that count. So if you have a credit report with 1 credit card, you're a thin file. If you have a credit report with 2 credit cards, it's a thin file. If you have a credit report with 3 credit cards, it's a thin file. And thin files are certainly, well, thin files generally indicate someone who's relatively new to credit, right? It's unusual that you'll see a 50-year-old with 1 trade line on their credit report. But it's not uncommon that you see someone who's, say, 18 to 21-year-old with 1 or 2 or 3 trade lines on their credit report, because they're at the beginning of their consumer credit life cycle arc. And we all start with 0 trade lines on a non-existent credit report. And so we all start with a trade line, if not 2 trade lines, then 3 trade lines. And so the downside to having a thin file is, well, there's 2 things. There's 2 reasons that there's 2 downsides to having a thin file. Number 1 is there's no guarantee that your credit report is going to be scored, because it may not meet the minimum requirements to qualify for either a FICO or a Vantage Score credit score, because you're just credit file does not equal credit score. Your credit file has to meet certain minimum standards in order for it to be scoreable, and a thin file is less likely to meet those requirements than, my credit report or your credit report, which may have pages and pages of stuff on it and is not a thin file and is, easily meets the scoring criteria. So that's number 1, is that you may not qualify for a score. Number 2 is that you are being scored in unique scoring environments called scorecards that are designed for people that have thin files. And so there is a single file scorecard, a single trade line scorecard, a 2 trade line scorecard, and a 3 trade line scorecard. Collectively, those are referred to as thin file scorecards. The cap on your score in a thin file scorecard is going to be lower than the cap on a scorecard for someone who does not have a thin file. So straight out of the gate, the max score you can achieve with having a thin file is going to be lower than the max score you can achieve by having a credit report with more information on it. So, those are two problems with having thin files. A third is volatility. You can, go from having, if you had 4 trade lines and you got 1 deleted, you're now a thin file. So your score is going to change if for nothing other than the fact that you just became a thin file. Things like utilization, things like late payments are much more problematic for people who have thin files, because there's not that other information to help subsidize those types of changes. And those types of changes would likely cause anybody's credit score to go down, regardless of how much information you had on a credit report. But they're especially volatile for people who have thin files.
Excellent. Great answer. We got a question from Rick Phillips. What about a closed account in good standing over 8 years old?
Yeah, as long as it's still on your credit report, that's good. I can tell you that all 3, if it's in good standing, then there is no obligation under the Fair Credit Reporting Act to remove it, ever. The credit bureaus don't have to delete it. But the credit bureaus all currently have a policy whereby they will delete inactive accounts after a decade. So if that account was closed 8 years ago and it has been inactive since then, which why wouldn't it be if it's closed, then that account has 2 years left before the credit reporting agencies will choose, as a matter of policy, to remove it. And so, so I guess a follow-up question would be, well, so what? Well, the so what is that there's a metric in credit scoring systems that people love to ignore called time and file, which essentially takes various age-related measurements of your credit report. And one of those age-related metrics is the average age of your accounts. Yeah. And so if you've got a credit account that's 8 years old, soon to be 9 years old, and soon to be 10 years old, and then gone, your average age of trade is going to go down. It's a mathematical certainty. It has to go down. It can't go anywhere else but down. So you may have just become younger in the eyes of credit scoring systems simply because you had an inactive account removed from your credit report. So, for someone who's got a 25-page credit report, that's kind of a non-issue. For someone who has a thin file, that's a really big deal.
Yeah, and one thing too, I experienced that firsthand when I had it was a block of time where I owned a lot of property, multi-unit property, my own home and a couple of other homes, and after the Great Recession, when the ones that were in good standing fell off, I felt that one. I mean, that was and because they were 10 years old. These are houses that I sold where they had good history, but after that 10 years when they dropped off, I definitely felt that.
You have one of the things that often comes out, like I actually, believe it or not, I was a defense expert witness in a lawsuit where a consumer sued a mortgage lender because they didn't report their mortgage trade line. Not that they reported it incorrectly, but that they didn't report it at all. And it actually was an interesting case because it brought up the issue of, do you have a right to a credit report, or do you have a right to an account? And the answer is no, you don't. You don't have the right to a credit report. You don't have the right to any particular account on your credit report, even if you have a relationship. There's no obligation for any furnisher. Well, I guess that there wouldn't be a furnisher if they didn't furnish. So there is no obligation for any lender or loan servicer or credit card issuer or credit union or debt collector to report anything to a credit reporting agency. It's a matter of choice. So the case was dismissed on summary judgment, which means it was disposed as a matter of law rather than a matter of like a jury verdict. But it was an interesting issue that, and so you kind of ran into the same deal, David, is you have this really good information on your credit report. You'd really like it to not go anywhere. But the problem is that because you don't have a right to information on a credit report, you have a right to accurate information, but you don't have a right to information. So after a decade, the bureaus are going to choose to remove that stuff. And one of the reasons, they're not doing it just to be jerks, right? They're not doing it to be punitive. That despite what you think about credit bureaus, that's not in their MO. Yeah. They're doing it because after a decade, it's very unlikely that information is verifiable any longer. And as you know, one of the requirements in the FCRA is that information not only has to be correct, but it also has to be verifiable. And after a decade, it's less likely to be verifiable than it is after 6 months of inactivity. So that's really the issue, is it now becomes a matter of verifiability.
Interesting. I would have suspected that maybe it would have something to do with the fact that, well, this is a decade-old account. It's closed. Maybe this doesn't accurately represent where you are right now in time, being that credit reports are designed to give a snapshot in time, and is something you did 10 years ago really as relevant as what you're doing now and maybe the last couple of years?
Yeah, certainly the performance on accounts over the last 12 to 36, the more recent or contemporary management of credit is more meaningful in credit scoring systems. However, the time and file metrics, that average age of trade and the age of the oldest trade, that is all about longevity, my friend. And so you really, to the extent, my first account on my credit report, you're going to love this, was I was added as an authorized user on my father's Sears card.
Yeah, I think you told me.
He opened it in 1956. So I had a trade line on my credit reports
that was older than
that essentially was opened when I was 12 years old, which is obviously impossible. But by the time I had it added to my credit report, I was 18 or 19, and the account was over 2 decades old already.
Yeah.
So it's it's one of those things that, and I don't have it on my credit report any longer. I don't even know if the Sears card even exists. It was one of those really thin, narrow plastic credit cards.
I had a Sears card. That was my first credit card, a Sears card, back in like 1989, I think.
Yeah, it was kind of an off-white color, and it had been in my father's wallet for so many decades it had kind of become discolored. And anyway, the long and short of it is that I really liked having that on my credit report because it was just so old. But now, thankfully, as the age that I am, I don't need something like that to help boost my score.
Right. Let's see. We got a question here from Brickster00. What happens when you pay your last car note? Would that make your score go down? If so, why? That's a great question.
It is a good question. It kind of identifies the counterintuitivity of scoring systems. Your score, by the way, the same thing happened to me when I paid off a mortgage loan. It was my last installment debt, and my score went down. I mean, it went down like 3 or 4 points. It wasn't anything drastic.
Yeah.
But scoring systems like to see activity. They like to see activity on installment accounts. They like to see activity on revolving accounts. And to the extent, an installment account is a very different animal than a credit card account, right? Your payments are generally higher. It's usually tied to some sort of a physical asset. So it's a very different type of debt than a credit card. And because of that, you're actually, believe it or not, you're rewarded for having properly manage that type of an account. And the only time you're actively managing that type of an account, of course, is when there's still a balance associated with it. So once you either finish paying off an installment loan, or you refinance an installment loan and therefore the balance is zero, or sell an asset and then use the proceeds from the sale to pay off the loan, then you're no longer managing that account. And so there is a possibility that your score would dip. Look, I'm not talking about turning an 800 into a 500. Let's not misrepresent or misunderstand what I'm saying. But there certainly is a possibility because of the lack of any recent installment loan history.
Yeah. So just to add a little to that, Brickster, same thing happened to me it was about 2 years ago or so. I had my car on a lease, turned it in. It was the only installment loan that I had. And I was expecting it though. I mean, I've been in this long enough to know that I expected there was going to be some drop. It wasn't substantial. It was maybe 20, 30 points, but that's a normal swing for my credit score anyway, because it has something to do, or it has almost everything to do with what my credit card balances are. Usually I pay them off, but sometimes if there's a balance, and then there's that effect. Okay, Mike with a question. So my bankruptcy is 4 years old. Was curious if is that affecting me as much as it did when it was new? I've established lots of new credit with hardly any debt. Awesome. Good job on that, Mike.
Yeah, I would say that I'd love to see what your credit score, the chronology or the trajectory of your credit score since maybe a year or two before you filed to now. One of the great misperceptions in the world of credit scoring is that a bankruptcy, devastates your credit scores for, I mean, if it's a Chapter 7, then up to a decade. If it's a Chapter 13, then up to 7 years. That's just factually inaccurate. A Chapter 7 actually might cause your credit score to go up. The debts that are discharged in a Chapter 7 are already likely in some form of default. The collections are already bad. So you're not, if you include a debt in a bankruptcy, you're not turning it from a derog to a super derog. It's still derog. It doesn't get any worse. So really all you're doing is you're eliminating the debt that is associated with those defaulted accounts. And so what happens to a credit report is all of those balances, either collection balances or past due balances or current balances on the statutorily dischargeable debts, are eliminated. And the credit reporting guidelines now require collection agencies to delete collections that are included in bankruptcy. Delete, not show them included in bankruptcy, remove them. Yeah.
And when did that take place?
I know that they were in the guidelines last year, so I don't know if they became the guidelines at the end of 2019, but they've been in the credit reporting guidelines for at least a year. You know what we'll do before we do the next one of these Facebook Lives, I'll tell you when, because I have the standards manuals going all the way back to almost 18 years ago, and so I can tell you when that was added as a standard. So my guess, without knowing, is that your credit score probably has gone up since since you filed, and also the yeah, you shouldn't be shocked. You should be shocked because that's counterintuitive, but that's actually very similar to what happens. Look, credit scoring systems follow. If I hear FICO say this one more time, or if I say it one more time back in my FICO days, I'm going to puke. FICO scoring systems follow the data. That's what they do. They follow data, and the data has repeatedly indicated that people who file bankruptcy are not dirtbags. Okay. People who file bankruptcy generally file bankruptcy for some reason other than they're bad people. They file bankruptcy because they either had a divorce, that was, a divorce in the earning family, or a death in the earning family. They lost a job. They had a failed business. They had a failed business partnership. There's usually some plausible medical. There you go, a massive medical debt that you were uninsured, and it completely wiped you out. And so there's some reasonable explanation as to why you filed for bankruptcy protection, and it's not always that you're just a bad credit risk. And so because of that, the bankruptcy, which, look, I'm not saying it's a good thing for your credit reports, but it's not the landmine that people generally think that it is, and which is one of the reasons why people tend to be able to recover as quickly as they can after a bankruptcy. And look, people who are still employed or are otherwise now employed and have filed a Chapter 7, unless they have tax liens and student loans, they have no debt. The debt is gone, and is in the context of the lenders being able to collect it from them. So what does that mean? No debt, currently employed.
Right.
That is not a bad credit risk. And so you're not going to get like, an Amex or a Visa with a $50,000 limit, or a 0% auto loan, or a 2.1% mortgage loan. But you would be surprised as to the quality of offers that you're going to eventually get from lenders, as it's assuming you don't do things like get back into a lot of debt or miss payments on newly opened obligations.
Yeah, Mike, notice one thing that John said in this, which reflects back on the conversation that you and I had this week, which is Amex. We were talking about the difference between score and lenders' criteria, and how Amex is not a big fan of bankruptcy. But John, just to add a little bit more to what you were saying, having done thousands and thousands of one-on-one consultations with people, one of the things that I was very surprised early on to learn is how fast people recover after they file bankruptcy. Like I've seen, I can't tell you how many credit reports I've seen where scores were in the high 700s, occasionally in the low 800s, with a bankruptcy in the public record, because they weren't a problem really. It was some extenuating circumstance that pushed them into bankruptcy, and they knew how to manage credit otherwise. So and they recovered just fine.
And the interesting, we were talking about thin file scorecards a minute ago, about how it's a unique scoring environment. There's a bankruptcy scorecard. And so there is a completely different scoring environment for people who have a bankruptcy on their credit report. And so, and to the extent that bankruptcy is not as indicative of, propensity to default as charge-offs and collections and settlements and repos and foreclosures, you have a higher cap on your max score while you have a bankruptcy than you would some of these other derogatory entries. And the time to recover is not as onerous as I think presumably people may believe. People think, oh my gosh, I'm never going to have a good score. 10 years before I have a good credit score.
I've heard that a lot.
No way, not even close.
It's shockingly fast if you're doing the right things. Robbie, I put your quote up and it went away. Okay, why won't my score rise, or how often should it rise? Oh, that's a good credit 101 question, John. You ready for that one?
Yeah. I mean, I know nothing about you or your credit report other than your question.
We have to take that in consideration. So John's going to have to paint with some very broad strokes here. Yeah.
I mean, look, the reason, first off, your credit score is not a component of your credit report. It's not like a thermometer where the temperature is constantly going up and down as the thermometer reading is going up and down as the temperature changes. So your credit score isn't sitting there going up and down as information on your credit report changes. It's calculated, it disappears, then it's recalculated the next time you or a lender causes it to be calculated. So some people kind of interpret that as, well, my score changed by 20 points or my score went up by 20 points. No, it's just different than the last time it was calculated, and it'll be different the next time it's calculated. So, why won't my score go up? Every time your score is calculated, the deliverable is the 3-digit score, and then up to 4 factors that are delivered with the score that explain why that score wasn't higher. So that's the answer to your question. And frankly, that's the roadmap to better credit scores, is to follow the 4 things that are articulated in those score factors. It might be derogatory entries that are too young. It might be credit card debt. It might be too many accounts with balances. God forbid it's too many inquiries, or maybe a combination of those things. But the score factors should make it very, very clear why your score is what it is and why it's not higher.
Also, Robbie, make sure you go through the tutorial videos in your Credit Versio. If you have a Credit Versio account, if you don't have you don't have to link a credit report to it. You can bypass that, go into the free account, into the tutorial section. There's a whole credit coaching chapter right there. It's great credit 101 that is being taught on what you need to do to build credit, and maybe if that's the issue. Scott's got a Credit Versio question. When Credit Versio emails me the letters to be printed and mailed, can they be sent in Word format, not PDF? Makes it easier to change no, Scott, unfortunately it doesn't. PDF is just the format that we're stuck with. Really what you can do, just copy it and paste it into a Word doc if you want, but it's really not time well spent. You can handwrite items in there. John, you worked in dispute resolution for Equifax. Does Equifax or any of the bureaus, as far as you know, care if you have any handwritten like your social or your date of birth in there when everything else is printed?
Yeah, the credit bureaus aren't stupid. They've been looking at credit repair letters for decades, and so they can pretty easily sniff out a credit repair letter versus a letter that someone actually typed on their computer or wrote by hand. I'm not sure I'd get all twisted up about that. There's a lot of stories out there about different kind of combination of typed versus handwritten information and whether or not one is more effective than the other. I can tell you from my seat, I've never seen any variance of written versus typed be any more effective. They still have the same obligations, whether they get the letter written in crayon as they would if it was typed on a computer. So, they still have to perform an investigation, and to the extent that your handwriting is legible and they can read the numbers or words, then they'll be able to pull your credit report and they'll be able to lodge your complaint and then perform their investigation. But I don't know if that's going to equate to any more effective or less effective results.
Yeah, I mean, we have, gosh, I guess almost 100,000 subscribers to Credit Versio. Currently, maybe about 16,000 sending out letters. Letters coming back is not anything that's ever an issue, largely because the letters are being printed by you, mailed by you. It's got your, postmark on it. So, and like what John was saying, they're gonna review it regardless. Okay.
They have to. They don't. The only time the credit bureaus, there's two exclusions to their obligations. Number one is if they reasonably have no idea what you're asking them to do. So if you write a letter and your letter is, "Hey, I'm John, I'm from Atlanta. There's a lot of bad stuff in my credit report." That's not a dispute. That's a letter. I didn't identify my last name. They have no idea who I am. They can't pull my credit report. If they did, they would have no idea what I'm disputing or why I'm disputing it. A reasonable person would not interpret that as a dispute. So they don't have to do anything with it, right? Number two is there is an exclusion for credit repair. If they believe that the dispute is frivolous, then they don't have the same obligations to perform an investigation. Do the credit bureaus leverage that provision? I'm not sure. I mean, I see tons of credit repair letters that get converted to dispute forms, that get converted to investigations, that get converted to credit report updates. So in my mind, or from this seat anyways, I don't think that is used very often as an exclusion. The reason is because it's so hard. Let's say I'm a consumer and I look up my rights under the Fair Credit Reporting Act and add some language in a dispute letter. Does that make me a creditor? Of course it doesn't. It makes me a consumer who did some due diligence and I understand what my rights are. So, but that smells like credit repair, right? Because most of the time consumers are not well versed in their rights under the Fair Credit Reporting Act, especially the sections, the language, the case law. So from the credit bureau's perspective, it's actually safer for them just to allow these letters to go through the system, turn them into disputes. wait for the furnisher to respond, and then, let the chips fall where they may. It's easier for them to do. It doesn't cost them anything to process those.
Yeah, excellent. Okay, Liz, we got a big question. Hold on. An account was charged off and awarded a civil judgment. Is it worth disputing the charge off? I'm concerned that after the investigation and verification process, there will be a bigger detriment. Okay, where a negative public record shows up. Oh, hold on. Let me bring that back. Shows up on my credit report. Well, there's a couple areas in here, John, I know you're not going to want to touch, and there's maybe an area that maybe I can get into, but okay, so charge off, awarded a civil judgment. Okay, so public records, for one thing, they don't show up on your credit report. I just want to make sure that you understand that. At least not nothing other than a bankruptcy. So it sounds like you got sued, Liz, and if you want to dispute, listen. As far as the dispute side goes, you can dispute anything you want. Anything that is not reporting accurately, if you see something on it that doesn't look right, maybe outdated, maybe it's maybe it's got some issues with it, that's what you want to dispute. Credit Versio can give you some suggestions if you like, or you can create a custom reason. I don't know that I can think of any blowback from doing a dispute. Can you, John?
No, I mean, again, you have the right to challenge anything on your credit report with which you disagree. To the extent that you disagree with the charge-off, I mean, what about the charge-off is objectionable to you? Was it not your account? Was the balance wrong? Did they really not charge it off? Did they not process a payment appropriately? I mean, you have to articulate what it is about the charge-off that you feel is incorrect. If it's now a judgment, it means you were sued, and you either didn't show up in court and they got a default judgment, or you showed up in court and you lost. So I guess my point is that there's other issues I think that you should also concern yourself with, other than the fact that you may have a charge off on your credit report. One is that you now have a judgment creditor floating around out there, and that judgment creditor can now use the power of the law to compel you to pay them, and that means garnishment. So you should be aware of that. And David is correct. Civil judgments are no longer on credit reports. They haven't been on credit reports since mid-2018, but they are public records, which means that anybody can find them. I can find them. David can find them. Anybody can find them. They're public records. That's why they're called public records. If you apply for a mortgage loan, you're going to have to disclose that you're subject to a judgment, or you're committing application fraud. So again, it would be fantastic if you could address a couple of things, maybe, which is, the credit reporting, that's certainly an issue, but also the fact that you have a judgment floating around out there that you're not going to be able to ignore, because eventually there's a reason why you got sued. The reason you got sued is because someone wants to leverage their rights as the creditor. Now they've been able to do so, and now even though it's not on your credit report, they can still come after you for payment. So you should probably talk to them about maybe settling and kind of disposing of the judgment, getting it satisfied, and then you have your credit reporting issues to deal with.
Yeah, judgments they can definitely ruin a good night's sleep, especially if you're wondering, am I going to wake up one morning and all the money in my bank account's going to be gone? So I've heard plenty of stories like that. Mike, every time I'm on here, I learn something new. This is awesome, Mike. I love it. I'm glad you're here. Brickster again. My Vantage Score is higher than my FICO score, but they both max out at 850. Which one should I consider a more accurate account of my credit value to lenders? Love it. Great question.
That's interesting, because my Vantage scores have been consistently lower than my FICO scores, and so it's interesting that we have exactly the opposite experience.
Yeah.
So the score that is the most important score to you is the score that the lender is going to pull the next time you apply for something. That could be a FICO branded score. That could be a Vantage Score branded score. That could be one of a variety of generations of FICO scores and one of a variety of generations of Vantage scores. So there is no single 3-digit number that is the best representation of your risk. The best representation of your risk is whatever score Wells Fargo is going to pull, or Chase is going to pull, or Discover, or Amex, or Citi, or any of those lenders are going to pull the next time you go to apply for something. The good news is they're all based on the same 3 credit reports. And to the extent that all 3 of your credit reports indicate that you're a low credit risk, all of your scores are going to be good, whether they're called FICO scores or Vantage Score credit scores. And so they should all say the same thing about you, which is that you're either a fantastic credit risk, or that you're a moderate credit risk, or that you're a poor credit risk. And so the lender is going to get that same idea regardless of what type of score they pull, and probably also which credit report they use.
Okay, Scotty, great question, Brickster. I had paid off a couple collection. All were deleted from the 3 bureaus but one, and it's been a year. What's the best way to handle this? John, this was you mentioned this, I think, 2 or 3 lives ago. Let me put that back up. About what happens to collections when they get paid. Maybe you can go into that.
Yeah, so I can't help you with what's the best way to handle this. That's kind of a credit repair question, I think. But I can tell you that if collections are paid and they're medical collections, they now have a 0 balance, the collection agencies have to delete them. Those are the new rules under the new credit reporting standards. If they're paid or being paid by an insurance company, they have to be removed. If they are included in bankruptcy, they have to now be removed. Even if they're not removed, and they're showing as a 0 balance collection, the newer credit scoring systems, the newer versions, the more contemporary versions of scoring systems are going to ignore those because they don't consider collections that have a 0 balance any longer. Even though it may cosmetically still appear on the credit report, the newer scoring systems aren't going to consider it. Here's the exception, and you may have heard me go off a couple of Facebook Lives ago about this. Mortgage lending. Mortgage lending still uses credit. Get this. I haven't worked for FICO when did I leave FICO? I haven't worked for them in 17 years. The mortgage industry is still forced to use FICO scores that were built when I still had 4 years to go in my career at FICO. If that gives you any idea just how ancient those scores are. Those scoring systems do not have any of those $0 collection protections, none of that stuff. So a medical collection or any kind of a collection that has a balance or doesn't have a balance, regardless of whether it's paid, settled, whatever, they're all equally bad. And that's because that version of the scoring system the mortgage industry essentially is being forced to use it by FHFA. They have no other option, that they're forced to use it. So, but this isn't an issue in any other type of lending. It's not an issue in credit card. It's not an issue in auto loan. It's not an issue in personal loan. It's not an issue in anything except for Fannie and Freddie, FHA, FDA, anything that kind of falls up underneath the FHFA guidelines.
Yeah, and the reason why, Scotty, I put that up there and I wanted John to address that was that I don't think it really is a credit repair question or issue at all, because, as John said, cosmetically it's there. But apart from you financing getting a mortgage loan, this is not something that's scorable anymore. It just doesn't look good, but it's not going to affect you. So if you get an auto loan, credit card, assuming that they're using a more contemporary FICO model, this is a non-issue. Okay. Mike's question, is it true there's a window, let's say if I apply for one loan, then wait a few days and apply for a credit card, this will not hurt my credit with multiple pulls? Good question, Mike.
Yeah, so you're asking about the inquiry logic. David, do you mind throwing that back up there if you can? Or actually, I think I may have the ability to do it. Yeah, so the answer to your question is kind of. Credit card inquiries are not covered by the kind of consumer-friendly inquiry logic in FICO's credit scores. So if you apply for a mortgage loan, auto loan, or a student loan from any lender that can offer those types of loans, that inquiry is ignored for 30 days. I actually should write it up on the board because it's very complicated. But then you'd see that I'm in shorts, and so that wouldn't be a very good visual. So those inquiries aren't counted for the first 30 days that they're on file. After 30 days, any of those inquiries that are within 45 days of each other are considered one inquiry in the scoring process. And then when they turn 12 months old, they don't count at all, because no credit scoring systems count inquiries that are over 12 months old. Credit card inquiries are not part of that. It's just lenders where you can get a mortgage, an auto loan, or a student loan, and that's how that works for FICO. For Vantage Score, it's a little bit different. Vantage Score is any inquiry at all that's within 14 days of another inquiry. So there's no 30-day safe harbor period, and there's no 45-day window. It's any inquiries at all that occurred within 14 days of each other, up to 12 months again, and then any inquiries that are over a year old don't have any impact on the score at all. And the reason they're doing this, obviously, is because they don't want to penalize consumers for rate shopping, right? If you go to an auto dealership and you get shotgunned, you can end up with 5 or 6 auto inquiries on your credit reports. You're not looking for 5 or 6 auto loans. You know you've been shotgunned, and you're just deciding which offer to choose. Or if you proactively go out and get pre-qualified for a mortgage loan from a couple of mortgage brokers, you may end up with multiple mortgage inquiries. You're not looking for 2 houses. You're looking for 1 house. And so you're just shopping around. So the logic behind this, the way that these scoring systems treat inquiries, is they're trying to mimic how a consumer shops for credit. They look for different types of offers and terms and deals in a pretty short period of time for a single type of loan, and then they take out the loan and then they move on. And that's what this is meant to mimic.
Excellent. Okay, Mike, I'm sure that answers your question there. What are we time-wise now? About 43 minutes. Okay. Well, this is usually about when we call it a day. I think we got some good questions today, John.
Yeah, great questions.
Excellent. Let me scroll through, make sure we didn't miss anybody. I think somebody had a credit repair question, which I'll go through and find it. I think it's up here somewhere, and I'll answer it in the comments. But I know there's 1 or 2 questions that I might have missed. Okay. All right. There's no other last-minute questions. I want to thank everybody for joining me today on Q&A Wednesday. Thank you so much, John, for participating again. It's always great to have you. And if anybody who watches this video after the fact, post your questions, and I pop in here usually a couple of times a day to see what questions are asked, and I'm more than happy to answer them. So thanks again for joining me, and until next week, take care.